Welcome to Sir Henry Fraser, His Life in Focus. I'm Miles Eversley, thanks for joining us. As discussed in the previous programme, Sir Henry, in his contributions to historical and architectural preservation, has authored and published a number of books and articles on the subject.
Two major consequences came out of it. One was the suggestion that I should produce an A to Z of Barbados heritage, and that suggestion came from the chairman of Heinemann Caribbean, a friend called Pat Rousseau, who was also the president of the Caribbean, of the West Indies cricket organization at that time. And as chairman of Heinemann Caribbean, he said, I'd love to see this book, the A to Z of Barbados heritage. And I went about it by happening to meet a few days later Sean Carrington, professor now of biology at the Cayfield campus, and I told him of this idea that I'd been given 3 days before, and he said, that's a brilliant idea, I'd be happy to work with you. And we then went to a historian who we knew was working on all sorts of local Barbadian history that we were interested in, and that was John Gilmore, lecturer at the Cayfield campus. And of course I had a school friend, Addington Ford, who was now the folk culturist at the National Cultural Foundation. So I'd already seen a couple of his little books, and I called Addy up and I said, Addy, would you work with us on this book, the A to Z of Barbados Heritage? And Addy said, of course, I'd love to do so. So I then planned what was a 4-month work schedule, because Heinemann told us that if we wanted this book published in time for Christmas, because you know Barbadians only buy books just before Christmas. You buy a book and give me for Christmas, I buy a book and give you for Christmas. The rest of the year we're illiterate and all we read is the newspaper. So I organized the program, and I was told by Heinemann, get that book to us by the middle of May if you want it published by November to sell for Christmas. So I organized a team here at my home. My wife was wonderful. She said, of course you can have the dining table and you can work around the dining table, but don't expect me to feed you all. And so every Tuesday afternoon I would leave the hospital and drive by that wonderful pizza place that was established in Rockley. Do you remember where the Coconut Plaza is now? Shakey's Pizza. It was a small world, you see, because Shakey's Pizza was actually being run by the son of my friend Pat Rousseau, who had been delegated to develop this pizza place in Barbados, and it was the best pizza in Barbados for a number of years, and then young Rousseau got tired of it. But I would pass by and buy 2 pizzas, okay, and go into the supermarket and pick up 2 6-packs of Banks Bear, you see, and bring it home and put the bear in the fridge, and the pizza was there. And so what my wife did was to warm the pizzas up when we were ready, and we would sit around the table meeting at 8 o'clock every evening, and we worked from 8 to 12. And we discussed, we plotted the book, we decided what was going to go into the book, and in the first edition there were a little under 500 entries, the second edition went over 500 entries, and the third edition today of the A to Z of Barbados Heritage is nearly 650 entries on everything in Barbados, from Adams right down to Zouave, from A to Z. So Grantley Adams, Tom Adams, and then the Zouave band at the end, with everything in Barbados, people, places and things, conchies, sea eggs, sea urchins, the settlement, independence, everything is there. And we formulated what the book would contain. We decided which of the 4 of us would do what. So that Sean did all the flora and fauna as the biologist, Addy did everything with folk culture, the games, the calypso, crop over, everything. I did architecture and people, and John Gilmore did history and people. We split the people between us. And we got to work. And the next Tuesday, we came back, because this was before IT. This was before the web. This was before the computers and the email. So we could only do hard copy. So each of us had to produce the text of what we agreed we would write in that week, you see. Now, all of us were busy people. We had workaday jobs. So it meant that we had to spend nights and weekends when we could spare it writing these articles and bring them back the following week. And the first hour of the following week would be spent with everybody reading everybody else's article and critiquing proofreading and that sort of thing, until eventually we had a finished product. And then the second part of the night's meeting would be deciding what we would each work on for the following week. And the next week we'd come back and we'd repeat this process of iteration. And then eventually we had to have a typist type it all up. And I organized that so that we had a manuscript properly typewritten. And then Sean was the photographer man. And Sean chose most of the photographs. John Gilmore supplied, Addie supplied photos and drawings, I supplied photos of buildings. We put it all together and we sent off color slides. In those days were used by the printers, and we sent a manuscript with slides, and we produced the first edition of the A to Z of Barbados Heritage. And it was enormously successful. We had a second edition a few years later, and after a long gap, we've now produced the much bigger and better third edition published by Miller Publishing, and that's been a fantastic task that we've really enjoyed. The other thing that came out of my work on historic architectural research was a series of articles with the Advocate. I became very friendly with the late Warren Alleyne. Now, Warren was a natural, instinctive historian and a good writer. He had a slightly formal style, but he had all the history of so many buildings. Warren just loved doing his research, and he researched the newspapers going back as far as newspapers went in the archives. So we would identify a building, and we produced this series for the Advocate called Our Architectural Heritage Reborn. And so I would identify an old house that he happened to have done research on. And if he hadn't done research, I'd go to another house. And then he would suggest a house that was interesting, that was owned by an important or interesting person, you know. He told me of the so-called Malatta lady who had built Erin Hall, on Bishop's Court Hill. And this woman had made great wealth in her merchandising, her shopkeeping days. She'd made great wealth, and she built this mansion back in the early 19th century, Erin Hall, which was subsequently owned by the Wilkinson family of Wilkinson, Haynes and Challoner. And so it was that kind of house that Warren was fascinated by, because he was fascinated by the people who had owned it. And together we produced 53 articles on our architectural heritage. And a lot of them, whenever we saw an old house being restored, we featured it. And we promoted heavily the chattel houses, and we promoted streetscapes like Belmont Road. And there were a lot of features on the schools sometimes, Lodge School and Harrison College and their old buildings. And that was great fun. But I would say that that era was a challenging era, because I was establishing my research and I was working hard by day. I was giving lectures, I was working on lectures at night, so I had to isolate a couple of nights a week, and I always devoted Sundays, unless we were on emergency duty, my team, on a Sunday. And those were the occasions when I did this kind of work. It led eventually, rather later, to other TV series, and the creme de la creme was the series called Pillars of Worship. Because Pillars of Worship was an amazing commission. CBC asked me if I would do a series on churches, and instead of the 15-minute films that I did for Treasures, we agreed there would be half-hour films on the churches.
Welcome to Pillars of Worship, a series of 7 programs on the history of worship in Barbados. From the first wooden churches of Holetown and Bridgetown to the many, many churches and the many expressions of our spirituality in our continuing search for God.
So I did these 7 films, beginning with early worship in Barbados after the settlement, and talking about the very early churches, which would have been wooden churches, and moving on with 2 more series on the Anglican Church, so that we could fully portray the fantastic Gothic revival of Barbados.
Churches were important, and the first church was almost certainly built here at Holetown on God's holy acre, St. James Parish Church. The island was first divided into 6 parishes, based on the distribution of 6 churches, with their vestries, the old-time church committees, and comprising landowners, as in England, to administer church funds and to pay the priests. The churches were St. James Church at Holetown, although an early map shows it labelled the Whole Church, and St. Michael near the bridge or Bridgetown. as far north as Indian River. There was Christ Church from South Point to Digby, somewhere in St. George. St. James from Indian River to just north of Holetown. St. Thomas from just north of Holetown to just north of Speightstown. St. Peter from just north of Speightstown to Sixmen's Bay. And St. Lucy all the way to the North Point. But it was considered hugely important for people to be able to get to the churches, and clearly other chapels were built elsewhere. All the locations aren't known, but by 1640, that is within 15 years of the settlement, those original 6 parishes were further divided to form 11 parishes with their churches, with St. Philip, St. George, St. John, St. Joseph, and St. Andrew being defined. St. Andrew was sometimes called Scotland, and then St. Andrew over the hill. And then All Saints was built high in the hills of St. Peter, the first of the chapels later to be called Chapels of Ease. Of course, it was first a little wooden church, and not this beautiful building of today.
Barbados exercised an amazing story of church building, because when the old wooden churches were replaced by solid stone churches, the fashion for church building was a Georgian design. And then Bishop Coleridge came here in 1825, and he was trained at Oxford, educated there, and he was very much into Puritan and the Gothic revival. So he had Georgian churches like St. Mary's, which had been designed. He had a tower added with castellations. And in the 1860s, the passion for Gothic had become so strong that all of the older pre-Gothic Georgian churches had towers added and chancels added with all of the features of Gothic, which I always say is pointy architecture, the finials pointing up towards God and the tower with its castellations pointing to God. So doing that series, Pillars of Worship, covered all worship types, so that we moved on from the Anglican Church then to the Methodists and the Moravians, and then to the Jewish synagogue, the Jews, and finally the Muslims in the very last, the Muslims and the evangelists and the Church of God and the Christian Mission and all of them. So it was 7 half-hour films, a total of 3.5 hours of filming, longer than the great film of the Ten Commandments, for example. So Barbados celebrated its anniversary of Parliament, 350 years, just around the time that I had just finished doing Treasures of Barbados. So of course CBC said, what about doing some films to celebrate the Parliament? And I did 2 sequences on Parliament 350, telling the story of how our Parliament was formed and bringing us right up to date for the 350th anniversary. When the 375 anniversary came around, 25 years later, they came back to me and said, we want a series. And I mentioned this to the parliamentary committee organizing and planning the celebration, and the parliamentary committee chaired by the MP Michael Carrington said, what a wonderful idea, go for it. So I then set about doing a different kind of series. I decided that I would mix history with interviews. So I interviewed all of the people that I considered the important and still eloquent, still thinking, still remembering members of Parliament who had played important roles. Well, of course, I did not have Prime Ministers like Mr. Barrow and Mr. Adams or Mr. St. John to talk to, but I did interview all of the other significant people, Prime Minister Sandiford, major ministers of government, the Member of Parliament, the politician, who most importantly did not actually become Prime Minister but could have and possibly should have, Mr. Smith, Sir Freddie Smith, Sir Frederick Sleepy Smith. He was one of my interviewees, and of course Dame Billy Miller and the former President of the Senate, Sir Fred Gollop, my old school friend, and the, at the time, President of the Senate, Carrie-Anne Eiffel. So all of these people were interviewed, and I interviewed them in the chair in which they had sat in Parliament. And that was tremendous fun. We got lots of lovely stories. We got the personalities coming out from Dame Billy and Sir Sleepy. And they told lovely stories. Sir Fred Gollop in the Senate, sitting in the President's chair in the Senate. And he, you know, he came across as a peacemaker, basically. That was great fun. And it's worth telling that Dame Billy was very strong that we should save some money and simplify our governance by having a unicameral chamber. I asked one or two of the others about their view on that, and they were wishy-washy on it, so it didn't seem to come across very strong. But Dame Billy felt very strongly about it, as she did about becoming a republic. So I had great fun doing that, and I produced these 4 films, pro bono, of course, for the government and the Parliament and CBC on Parliament 375. The other films that I made were also pro bono for charity. I made a film about Tyrrell Cott. I made a film about St. John's Parish Church, basically as fundraisers, so that DVDs were made, or rather in the old days it was the reel-to-reel videotapes were made so that they could be sold to raise money for Tyrrell Cott and to raise money for St. John's Church. And that was always great fun. Of course, St. John's Church is the place that I knew like the back of my hand, and I've done so many tours of St. John's Church for individuals and for groups. It's really where my soul is. In later years, of course, I've had fun not just doing the films that I wanted to do, but participating in the wonderful series that my friend Sherwood McCaskey dreamt up, because Sherwood has a vivid imagination, a wide vision for what will make very, very viewable filming. And you know, one of the greatest compliments I've ever been paid was when Sherwood told me that it was watching Treasures of Barbados that he decided he had to move into the filming industry, and that what he is doing today was inspired, at least in part, by Treasures of Barbados. And there are an awful lot of people that I would meet in Bridgetown, you know. I became famous not for my medical work, but I became famous in Barbados for Treasures of Barbados. And I would walk down Broad Street heading for a shop to buy something, and people would stop me and say, "You're Mr. Treasures of Barbados, you know, and I love your films." And you know, people would stop me. I couldn't go into town with my wife because my wife would get frustrated because people wanted to stop me and talk to me about my films, and then later days about National Trust. So working with Sherwood over the years, as now, talking to the camera and to Sherwood about filming series like Treasures, Tales from the Tombs and so on. And that of course relates very much to my work at St. John's Church, and relates very much to my vision that history must be made popular. My task as an amateur historian is to do the research and share it. I want to bring the research to the people. I want to tell his story and her story and make history relevant, you know. My wife always said that she didn't enjoy history because she couldn't remember all those dates. And if you ask the average Barbadian, 9 out of 10 will say they did not like history because they didn't like all those dates. And that was not really the story or the point of history. The point of history is what happened. And what happened is the story of the people. So I've made my history the story of the people. And therefore, I couldn't help being a big part of the Barbados National Trust. And having served on the council for a while, I worked with the most wonderful people. Sir Donald Wiles was a kind of mentor. He was a mentor for many people. He was a storyteller, and he helped me to shape my image of how I could popularize history because he was such a good storyteller. He always used to say when he met people whom he taught at Harrison College in his early days, and someone would say, "Oh, Sir Donald, you used to teach me." And he said, "No, no, no, my friend. I used to try to teach you." But he was a great raconteur, and he was the director of the trust, and Paul Foster was the president when I wrote my book. By the time I became a member, Sir Trevor Carmichael had become a president. And Trevor was innovative, and Trevor was breaking new ground because he was not more than 40, I think, when he became president. So he was president, and he and I worked very well together, very closely together. And during those early days, the National Trust had acquired Welshman Hall Gully. It had been given Morgan Lewis by the great benefactor, Mr. Bannister, and they soon acquired a long lease on Gun Hill Signal Station. And the man who brought Gun Hill Signal Station to life was the most wonderful man, Colin Webster. Now, Colin had been a planter in the early days, a member of the famous and prolific Webster family, one of many siblings. And Colin had actually managed the plantation Upton, where I now live in the little old plantation house at Upton. But Colin decided when the government bought all these lands, they bought the Webster Farm, Wildy, and they bought the Upton plantation, as government property. They wanted to develop it in various ways. And you know, that's where the Caribbean Development Bank is up the hill, and the CBC is on that land. So Colin decided to go into real estate. And Colin became a real estate person, real estate salesman, but he knew the building trade. As a planter, in the old days, planters built buildings, and every Bajan man who worked on a plantation was expected to know how to put two rocks together and to build a building and to put a roof on. So he was the man who did the restoration work at Gun Hill. Gun Hill had no roof at the time. It was just the walls and the steps that you went up to it, and the cookhouse and things like that. Colin restored it, brought it to life, brought gardeners in, planted wonderful trees and shrubs, created the Gun Hill signal station that we know today. It is really the landmark, the iconic landmark of the National Trust, and it has been used to promote the Trust in many ways. It has been on the cover of the telephone directory, and Sir Robert Schomburg, the great German historian who wrote our history, published in 1848, said that no visitor to Barbados should fail to go to Gun Hill, from which it was pointed out you could see 8 of the 11 parishes in the island. The only ones you couldn't see were St. Lucy, St. Peter, and St. Andrew. They were hidden by the mountains of St. Thomas and St. Joseph. So Colin was an amazing man, and he did everything pro bono. He would not allow himself to be compromised. He could not be paid for anything. Every brick, stone, every gardener was paid, but not Colin. He was the most generous man, and I learned so much from him. He was also a great raconteur, and he loved to tell stories, some of which were a little bit risque. But these three men, Sir Donald Wiles, Paul Foster, and Colin Webster, taught me a great deal about old buildings and about restoration and about the history of Barbados. Many of the stories that I tell in my current radio program, Did You Know, on Capital Radio, are stories that I've heard from these three gentlemen. So I got involved deeply in the National Trust. Other people on the council at that time were the famous Jack Skinner, who was involved in the building of the very first Barbadian and only Barbadian built plane, I think. The first plane to fly by a Barbadian in Barbados, because a couple of earlier events had occurred. And then there was Iris Banachie, who was an absolutely magnificent lady. And I like to call her Dame Iris, because she should have been made a dame. She was a woman of enormous vision, enormous energy, who was taught everything that Harry Bailey knew about science and about laboratories, and she ran his lab as well as supervising the building of the diagnostic clinic. She created the industry of floriculture, the production and the sale of ginger lilies and heliconias and so on, and she created her great garden. And it was when she was walking around my garden, after we became friends in the late 80s, that she told me that she was contemplating leaving her garden, Andromeda Gardens, to the Barbados National Trust for eternity, for Barbados and Barbadians. Iris was one magnificent lady, and I learned a lot from her too. Eventually, I was encouraged and persuaded to become president of the National Trust, and as a result, as president, I therefore put a lot more time into National Trust events. The Trust established a number of important trust sites which were very valuable intrinsically because of their worth. But unfortunately, the Barbados National Trust did not have the options that the British National Trust of accepting a gift only if it came with money. So I had become president when Mrs. Leacock, for example, called me one day and said, "Professor Fraser, I wish to give Wildy House, when I die, to the Barbados National Trust." And we accepted the gift, and this was a house of enormous architectural value. It had been owned by a member of the famous Leacock family, And it was an ideal place as the headquarters of the trust, where there was space that we could use the grounds, use the house as a show house, and we could do things that could embellish the image of the National Trust and hopefully encourage other gifts. But unfortunately, it didn't come with any cash. So although Mrs. Leacock said to me when we met with her that she had just had the house painted and it was in perfect repair, when she actually did die a couple of years later and we examined the house and the engineers and architects and I and Paul went over it, we discovered that it was A, termite ridden, B, needed a new roof, and C, the estimate was more than $500,000. So that was a complicated story. Similarly with Andromeda Gardens, Iris was a wonderful woman with a wonderful vision, but Iris used to sell the tickets for visitors to come into her garden at her back door, where her wonderful cook provided the tickets and people did their tour with Iris's little guide. But when Iris died, of course, the trust could not continue that kind of domestic arrangement. And so the director of the trust, of the gardens, had to live in the house, and we had to build a reception building. And the reception building had to be a proper reception building, which it was decided had to be spacious enough for groups to gather while going on the tour. It had to have a cafeteria alongside and so on. We also had to have a car park so that if we had bus tours, bus groups, we had to have spaces for the buses to park, because they used to park initially on Iris's driveway, and that couldn't work any longer. So the trust unfortunately got into huge debt over the Andromeda Gardens gift. We had Sean Carrington, our botanist, working very hard so that Andromeda could fulfill as much of Iris's desire in terms of research and training. And so training courses have always been a part of the Andromeda Gardens. With every director, we've had training courses of one kind or another to teach people horticulture.
Sir Henry's work with the Barbados National Trust does not end there. A number of other historical sites has been preserved and maintained through these contributions. We will learn of these and more in the next episode. This has been Sir Henry Fraser, His Life in Focus. I'm Miles Eversley. Thanks for your time.